Welcome to France Today Live. I'm Sophie Gardner-Roberts, web editor of France Today, and I'm your host today for this live interview in which we'll be chatting to guidebook author Zoe Smith, who has just released a rough guide to Corsica. She'll be sharing her favourite places to go on the island, including some exclusive little secrets for you. Without further ado, I'll invite Zoe to join me. If you could switch on your camera and microphone.
Zoe, Sophie, hi everyone.
Lovely to have you. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Just a quick little intro about you for all our viewers who don't know you. Zoe, you are a British travel writer, editor, and digital content creator based in France, but you've traveled and worked across 6 continents. You specialize in France, in the outdoors and adventure travel, and you serve as digital editor of FrenchEntrée.com and also travel writer for France Today. You've contributed to prominent publications such as The Independent, CNN, and The Telegraph, and you've been a guidebook writer for Rough Guides since 2011. Sounds about right?
It does.
All right, well, I'll let you start and take us on your trip to Corsica.
Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Well, quick introduction to me, and I won't spend too long on this because Sophie's already done a great job. But as Sophie said, yes, I'm the author of The Rough Guide to Corsica, which was published this summer. And I've been writing for the Rough Guides for a while now, as well as for many other publications. And yeah, I work for French Entrée, which is part of the France Media Group that publishes France Today. And so, of course, I do contribute quite regularly also to France Today. I've been traveling France my entire life since I was a little baby, and I now settled in Western France. So France is obviously one of the big focuses of my travel writing. And Corsica has long been one of my favorite French regions, especially as somebody who loves nature and the outdoors. Corsica is just perfect for that. So I was very excited to be invited to write this book. This guidebook is actually a new title for the Rough Guides. So I was really excited to be able to write a first edition as well. Okay, so a little bit about what I'm going to do in this presentation today. I want to give you a bit of a sneak peek into the guidebook, and I've put together a bit of a mini guide to Corsica. Hopefully that'll help inspire you to visit the island and help you as well put together your itinerary with lots of information for how to do that. So split today's presentation up into 3 main sections. First section is all about Corsica. So we'll have a look at the island and where it is, a bit about the history and culture, and hopefully convince you why you should visit Corsica. Then we'll get into the practicalities. So the logistics, how to get there, how to get around, and lots of advice and tips for planning your trip, where to stay, things like that. And then finally, the most exciting bit, I'm going to talk you through 10 things not to miss in Corsica. Our top recommendations pulled from the book, but also with a few lesser known suggestions and insider tips in there. And then finally, at the end, there will be time for questions. So if any of you do have questions, either as we go along or at the end, just pop them in the Q&A and Sophie will ask them to me. Okay, so Corsica. Corsica is France's 13th region. It's the southernmost region and also the smallest and least populated. It's part of France Métropole, or metropolitan France. It has 2 of France's 96 metropolitan departments, Haute-Corse, which is the northern half of the island, and Corse du Sud, which is the southern part of the island. It's known as Corse in French, or Les Corses for Corsicans in French. You can see on the map there that Corsica is actually in the Mediterranean. It's off the southeast coast of France, just off the French Riviera, the Côte d'Azur coast. It's actually closer to Sardinia and Italy than France. The Italian influence does have an effect on the history and cultural heritage of the island, which we'll get into a little bit later. Corsica has over 1,000 kilometers of coastline, 200 beaches, and more than 20 mountain peaks over 2,000 meters. It's both an amazing beach destination and also a very mountainous island.
Yeah.
I've also put a fun fact there, which you may already know or may not. Napoleon Bonaparte was actually born in Corsica's capital of Ajaccio. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. Okay, so why visit Corsica? Corsica is known as the Île de Beauté to the French, which is the beautiful island or the island of beauty. It's actually one of France's most popular tourist destinations, although more popular with the French, actually, than foreign tourists. Corsica actually welcomes 3.5 million tourists every year, which is quite interesting when you know that that's actually 10 times the population of the island.
Wow.
And a lot of them come in July and August. So my first tip would be, if you can travel outside of those two peak months, that would be recommended. Corsica has really beautiful Mediterranean beaches, white sand, turquoise, crystalline waters, loads of opportunities for snorkeling and scuba diving and things like that. It's also a very well-known place for outdoor activities. That mountainous terrain that we talked about earlier is perfect for hiking, mountain biking, canyoning, quad biking, paragliding, just about anything you can think of. You can probably do it somewhere in Corsica. It's also really well known for its natural wonders. Those beautiful mountains, dramatic sea cliffs, sweeping canyons, glacial lakes in the inland, forests, and lots of hidden little beaches and rocky coves. It's really a spectacular landscape to discover. And finally, the unique culture. So Corsica has a really rich history and a distinct cultural heritage that borrows quite a lot of influences from Italy and France, as well as traditional Corsican. So we'll get into that a little bit more in Corsican history. Okay, so we don't have enough time today to cover the entire history of Corsica. Corsica's very long and tumultuous history, but I do think it's important to have a little bit of context. So what I'm actually going to do for this is I'm going to read a couple of the opening paragraphs of the history section of the book, which starts with a quote that I think really characterizes Corsica today, and I popped that up on the screen for you as well. Corsica is France, but it is not French, Paul Thoreau wrote about Corsica back in the 1970s. It's a paradox that has been echoed by Corsicans since it was incorporated into France 2 centuries prior, and it's central to understanding the island today. Set on the Western Mediterranean trade routes, Corsica has always been of strategic and commercial appeal. Greeks, Romans have all left their mark, while 5 centuries of rule under the Republic of Genoa resulted in a revolt, the establishment of the short-lived Corsican Republic in 1755, and the eventual ceding of the island to the French in 1768. Corsica's troubles, however, were far from over, and the islanders' ambitions for independence were far from quashed. As Thoreau rightly observed, and travellers will quickly discover, the island remains distinctly not French. Nearly 2.5 centuries of French rule have had a limited influence, and many Corsicans remain committed to their indigenous heritage, Catholic traditions, and native language, along with, to the chagrin of many French presidents, their enduring fight for autonomy. It's a theme that's dominated Corsican politics over the past decades, leading to violent protests, bombings, and uprisings, settled down thanks to a permanent ceasefire in 2014, but flared up again in 2022. So it gives you a little bit of context. And I think that gives you quite a good overview. And of course, in the book, there is a full chapter on the history where we really go into all of these different eras. But for the purpose of this presentation, I really wanted to point out some of the key events. And I also wanted to just point out some of the historic sites around the island that you can see that relate to these events. So as you can see, starting with the prehistoric sites in Corsica, there are actually quite a few interesting prehistoric sites dotted around the island. And the most important of them are the ancient megaliths of Filatosa. These ancient menhirs with the little faces that you can see in the photo, they're quite a fascinating site. That's in the south of Corsica. Moving on to the Roman era, there are some interesting Roman ruins. In fact, the only Roman ruins that remain on the island at Illyria, which is on the east coast of the island. Moving into the Genoese rule, which was one of the most pivotal periods of history in Corsica. The most important thing from that era, at least architecturally, are these Genoese towers. Now, you'll see these all around Corsica, dotted along the coastline. In fact, I think there were more than 80 originally. I think about 67 now remain around the island. We'll talk again a little bit about these later, but this is something to keep in mind. Moving on to the Corsican Republic that I just mentioned, the Corsican Republic was quite a short-lived period of independence from Corsica, but it was such an important moment in Corsican history, and it's really something that Corsicans still talk about today, and especially people that are still campaigning for independence. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. They often talk about this period. And the key figure from that was Pascal Paoli. Pascal Paoli was the general that led this sort of revolution in a way and this push for independence and became the leader of this independent Corsica. And you'll see his statue in Corte, which is a central city right in the heart of Corsica. And you'll also see many, many things named after him. He's a very notable figure in Corsican history, so keep a lookout for that. Now, I want to point out a really interesting thought process, I guess, to think about with these two dates here. So 1768 was the date that Genoa ceded Corsica to France. So that's the date that Corsica became French. Now, 1 year later, Napoleon Bonaparte was born, which I think is so interesting because it's just this 1 year that changed everything. I mean, imagine if he hadn't been French. That could have changed not only the course of French history, but all of the European history. So moving on through the sort of Napoleonic era, and obviously I'm making it sound like this all moved smoothly. There were many different things that happened in the history, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll stick to the smaller things. But I think it is important to point out that during the initial period of French rule, this wasn't necessarily seen as a bad thing by most Corsicans. The Napoleonic era brought a lot of changes to Corsica, largely positive, a lot of improvements in education, healthcare, etc. And of course, Corsicans got their ability to go over to France and study and things like that. So it was, although I'm sure many Corsicans would have preferred independence, it was certainly the lesser of two evils after a long period of Genoese rule. This started to change after the World Wars. It really was the aftermath of the wars and the economic impact that that had on the country. And also in the 1960s, when Algeria separated from France and a lot of the immigrants then came over to Corsica, a lot of these things fed into this sort of unrest that really came to a head in the 1970s, as I mentioned. Now, I'm not going to get into all of these protests and political unrest. It is a little bit too complex for today's presentation. But the one thing I do want to mention is that while this does still go on sometimes, it's very, very separate from the country's tourist industry. So as a tourist, as a traveler traveling in the country, you're not really going to notice any of this. It's certainly not an unsafe place to travel by any means of the word. And interestingly, just this year, there have been some changes made. And Corsica has actually reached a deal with France for greater autonomy within the French Republic. So this could well be at the start of a new future for France and Corsica. Hope so.
Yeah.
Okay, a little bit about Corsican culture, and a lot of this is kind of tied into the history that we've already talked about. Most Corsicans that you will come into contact with as a traveler, I would say that they are both proud to be Corsican and French. And I put in that order because, well, it's quite an interesting one, actually. I find that if you talk to local Corsicans about their culture or their food or the music or things like that, if you refer to it as French, they'll very quickly correct you to, no, it's Corsican. On the other hand, if you refer to France as a very separate country and you talk about going to France or French people, they'll often correct you and say, oh, but Corsica is part of France. So it's important, I think, to be mindful of this as a tourist, as a traveler. I tend to refer to anything local as Corsican out of respect for the local culture. But if I talk about France, I will say le continent or mainland France, continental France. That way you kind of bridge the gap.
Mm-hmm.
The official language of Corsica is French. You will find English spoken in some of the tourist resorts as well. This changes a little bit as you go further into the mountains and the heartlands. But generally, you can get by with a little bit of French and a little bit of English as well, especially in tourist areas. However, many locals still speak Corsican, which is known in French as Corse or in Corsican as Corsu. Corsican is very similar to Italian, although I don't speak Italian, so please don't ask me to attempt to pronounce it in words.
You don't want to continue the presentation in Corsican, Zoe?
I don't think so. I have put two words that I can say. Buongiorno is hello or bonjour, and grazie, which is, I guess, similar to Italian, thank you or merci, as far as I got. Probably the most important thing to point out is, and you can see I put a little sign of Ajaccio, the capital there, with its Corsican translation. You will often see both written in Corsica on road signs, also maps, and sometimes old maps will only have the Corsican. And it can be a little confusing as a traveler because you think, is that the place that I'm actually going to? So just be mindful of that. Obviously, in the book, we do have English and French spellings of everything, so you can cross-reference and make sure you're going to the right place. Corsica also has its own flag, separate from the French flag, and locals are quite proud of this. So you will see it on lots of souvenirs and tourist things. They also have a little catchphrase that you'll probably also see on souvenirs, which is souvent conquis, jamais soumis. And this kind of speaks to Corsica's resistance and Corsica's independent spirit. It means in English, roughly translates as often conquered, but never submitted. Corsica is also very proud of its cuisine, and there are several foods and wines that have an AOC, an Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée label. We'll talk a bit more about cuisine later. And the last thing I just want to mention on the culture is Corsica is famous for its traditional polyphonic music. Traditionally, this is a 3-part a cappella group. It's usually male singers, and there are 3 of them, but often, especially today, you'll see females also taking part in it, and you'll also see bigger groups with different arrangements. These are often religious songs or songs of resistance. And I do really recommend, if you see, and you often will, especially in peak season, if you see signs up or posters up for concerts, I highly, highly recommend going to see one. They're often held in the local church or things like that. And it's just a really beautiful, really moving musical performance. And it's something, it's a real cultural experience. And it's similar. They're normally always sung in Corsican, occasionally in French. And normally if they do an introduction, it will only be in French. But it's a little bit like going to see the opera or something, but in the sense that you don't really need to understand the words to sort of feel the emotion of it. So I would really recommend that. Okay, let's move on to some of the practicalities. How to get there. So really you have 2 options for getting to Corsica. Either you fly or you take the ferry. There are 4 airports, Calvi, which is actually in the south close to Bonifacio, and Bastia. Air France and Air Corsica fly there from Paris, Nice, Marseille, and lots of other French cities. EasyJet and British Airways fly there seasonally from the UK. I don't think they have flights there out of season, but it is worth checking because they keep changing the times all the time. And from other European cities, you'll also find cheaper flights with Volotea and Transavia. For international visitors coming from America or Australia or other places in the world, there aren't any direct flights to Corsica. You will have to fly to France first and then take a connecting flight to one of the Corsican airports. Please note that taxis are quite expensive in Corsica. And unless you're renting a car, it is highly recommended that you try to fly in or take the boat into somewhere close to where you are staying. We will get a bit into driving around Corsica in a moment, and I've got some times of how long it takes to drive around, but it's a bit further than you think. And then ferry ports. So the ferry is actually a great way to get over to Corsica. That's my preferred method to go there, especially because I can drive over, bring my car from France, bring my dog with me if I want. And there's several places in both Italy and France that you can take the boat from. There's 5 ferry ports all around the island, so it's very well served. Bastia in the north, Île de Beauté on the northwest coast, Ajaccio again, Propriano, which is a beach resort a little bit south of Ajaccio, and then Porto Vecchio on the southeast coast. Okay. And how to get around in Corsica. So, I'm not going to lie, Corsica is a lot easier to get around if you have a car. I do highly recommend either bringing a car over with you from France or renting a car on the island. There's lots of places you can rent cars from. All of the airports have car rental. A lot of the ferry ports have them either at the port or close by. And it's also usually possible to rent them in mainland France and then drive over on the ferry. So the most important thing really with driving is Corsica, as I mentioned before, is very mountainous. There are inevitably very windy, in some parts narrow roads. Some of them are, well, I suppose it depends on your opinion. They're either thrilling or hair-raising, depending how adventurous you are. I absolutely loved some of the drives in Corsica, but I will also admit some of them I drove very slowly and carefully. So yeah, pick your roads wisely. My biggest tip I put on here is to stick to the T roads wherever possible. So the T roads, and these are the roads that are marked on this little map here on the right. These are the sort of main roads. They're all paved, they're all wide, they're less windy in places, but these are pretty easy, safe roads. You can normally get up a little bit of speed on these roads as well, because That's the other thing in Corsica is distances tend to take a lot longer than what you think. So although it might be a short distance to drive, say from Bastia over to Calvi, well, in fact, that's actually a 2-hour drive, even though it's just a little bit over the island. So always check the distances, allow for a bit of extra time. There is also a train. I would recommend taking a ride on the train because it's an absolutely beautiful journey. If you go from Ajaccio to Bastia, it goes all the way through the center of Corsica. So it's a really beautiful, beautiful scenery. However, it is quite slow. I think it takes about 3.5, maybe even up to 4 hours to get from Bastia to Ajaccio. So it's a long, it's not really something you want to do as a quick method of transport, but by all means add it in as an activity in itself. Buses, there are some limited services, but again, I really wouldn't rely on it. Most of the bus services that are reliable are really from Bonifacio to Porto Vecchio in the south and then up to Bastia. So you can get from certain airports down to the beach resorts and things like that by bus. But yeah, it's not the most efficient method. A little note about taxis. So firstly, Uber says it is available in Corsica. I've never found an Uber in Corsica. I'm sure one day somebody will, some entrepreneurial local will start Ubering. So I will look out for that, but please don't rely on that to get around. Local taxis are available, but one thing to note is you do have to book them in advance. Do not call up a taxi at the last minute to get to the airport because you'll be disappointed. Book those in advance and book them locally, find a local taxi driver. We also, of course, have all this information in the book. Okay, right, where to go in Corsica? So the first thing I want to say about this is Corsica isn't really a day trip or weekend trip destination. The cities are not, well, there are interesting things to do in the cities, and I definitely recommend visiting them. But in terms of what Corsica has to offer, that isn't really the highlight. So doing a city break to Bastia or to Ajaccio wouldn't be my recommendation. If you do have slightly longer than, a day or two, you could definitely fly into Ajaccio or Bastia, spend a day or two in the city and take a couple of day trips or rent a car and do a little road trip or something. So that is an option. But ideally, I'd say come for a week. At least pick 1 or 2 areas to base yourself in so you're not spending all of your time on the road. Maybe start out in the south and do a little bit of that area and then go to a destination up north for a few days. With 2 weeks, you can really take in all the highlights, especially if you rent a car. So that would be my sort of recommendation. And if you do have time, by all means, stay a bit longer and go exploring because there's plenty of stuff to see. This map in the middle is actually the chapter map for the book. So each one of these different sections is a different chapter in the guidebook. So I'm not going to get into all of the different things because we will go over this later, but I just want to give a quick overview of the different areas and what they're known for. So starting in the north, this is Bastia, which is the second largest city in Corsica, and the northern Corsica. This area is known for its rugged coastal roads, vineyards, there's some great wineries there, the historic city of Bastia, and quite a lot of beaches, but more secluded and rugged kind of beaches. It's that sort of vibe. Moving west, this is one of the primary tourist regions of Corsica, and for very good reason. It is absolutely packed with beautiful beaches, charming little hilltop towns. There's some great water sports and scuba diving, boat trips along the coast. This is a really beautiful area of Corsica. Moving down, number 3, the northwest. This area is best known for the UNESCO World Heritage Site, which we will talk about later. It's the only one on the island, and it's comprised of incredible sea cliffs and calanques. So this is a great area for spectacular drives, natural wonders, and some really pretty little coastal villages. It's not really a beach destination. Moving down, we have the Ajaccio region, which is the capital of Corsica, best known as Napoleon's hometown. So this is where the Napoleon Museum is, which is a great visit. It's an interesting city, but probably don't need to spend more than a day or two there. However, it does have some beautiful coastal walks around it and these little rocky islands off the coast, which are really pretty. To the south is, again, another one of Corsica's prime tourist regions. It's known for its really beautiful beaches. Bonifacio is one of the main cities. We'll go over that later. That's definitely one of my highlights. Island cruises, beautiful beaches, and also a lot of inland activities, canyoning and hiking and things like that. Moving up to Eastern Corsica. Eastern Corsica is probably the least visited area of Corsica, of the island. Has more of a local feel, so it's definitely a place to sort of get a bit off the beaten track. My tip for Eastern Corsica is really, if you are there in peak season and you want beaches that are not completely packed, Eastern Corsica is the place to go. They're not as built up as they are in the south. They don't have all the activities and tours and fancy hotels, but they are a great place to just find a quiet-ish stretch of sand in July or August. You probably won't find that anywhere else. And then finally, Central Corsica. The biggest city in Central Corsica is Corte, which you can sort of see all the roads lead up to there in the middle. Beautiful historic town. And really, Central Corsica is all about the mountains and getting outdoors. That's the place to go to hike, to swim, all of the activities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Quick one on where to stay. I've broken this down into some of the most popular areas that people do stay, and I've just color-coded this by price ranges. The most important thing to notice here is there are the two sort of main tourist regions that I've marked in red here. So the area in the Balan, Calvi and l'Île de Beauté, and then in the south with Bonifacio and Porto Vecchio. These are by far the most expensive places to stay, especially if you want to stay by the beach or in the town. And prices will also soar in July and August. I would highly recommend either renting a car so that you can stay a little bit further out from the resorts, or just staying somewhere else along the south coast, if saving money is your goal, because of course there are also some beautiful hotels there if you can afford them. So book well in advance for July and August. Mid-range places in the west around Porto Piana. In the south, Propriano is a very popular beach resort. And then up north, on the opposite side of the coast to Bastia, Saint-Florent is another really popular beach resort. However, all of these places, although they're very touristy and they get a lot of traffic, especially in summer, they're always a little bit cheaper. You can always find some mid-range options around there. And then finally, some of the best value hotels are actually in the cities. The two cities, you can find some really great budget places because most of the tourists only stay a night or two and then they move out. Or Corte in the center. So maybe consider some of those if you are on a budget. What else have I put? Yeah, check Airbnbs. There's a lot of Airbnbs in Corsica, and it can be a really affordable option. It's also a great way to meet locals, as often you do get people renting out sort of a little apartment upstairs or a room in their house or things like that. So if you do speak a bit of French, that can be a really nice way. Camping is also very popular in Corsica. You'll find a lot of campsites. So if you've got a car, that's a great one. And don't underestimate the driving distances. As I said before, just do plan this out, especially if you're limited on time, because as much as you will save money by renting a car and staying somewhere outside of one of the big resorts, you might also spend a lot of time on the road. Okay, let's get in.
Sandra is asking, what can I expect if I visit Corsica in November? Will sites be open and activities available, or do the communities shut down during the winter?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends where you go. I'd say November, firstly, it's a little bit late in the season. If you go, especially at the moment, we seem to be getting longer summers. It seems to be warmer well into October. I'd say going in late September or October, if you can, you will still probably find a lot of the things open. However, the main tourist season does tend to run from maybe late April or around Easter. May, definitely things will be open, and then through till September or end of September. So you will find some places closed down. That's not to say not to visit in the off season, but just be aware the weather in the mountains can be very quickly changeable. So outdoor activities may or may not be available in November. And at cities, on the other hand, I think absolutely you could visit the cities and do some of the little coastal walks just outside. That would probably be my best recommendation if you're visiting that late in the year.
And we have Keith, who you have kind of answered it, but just to confirm what your thoughts are on hiring a driver or a car for day trips.
Yeah, so you will actually find there are a lot of tour operators that do day trips. If you stay in one of the sort of main towns, Bonifacio has quite a lot. Both the main cities, Ajaccio and Bastia, do. And also smaller but tourist areas like Saint-Florent and Porto and places like that. You will find a lot of day trips there. So yeah, that's definitely an option. You don't have to drive yourself, especially if you're worried about driving on the roads. That could be a better option.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I'm not going to go through this, but I thought I would share with you one of the itineraries from the book. We actually do have 3 itineraries, and this is the sort of complete island tour with all the highlights in it. After the presentation, if you want to watch the replay or go back and screenshot this one and zoom in on the map, you can use this to plan your trip or use it as the base for your own itinerary.
Mhm.
Okay, a few useful links just to wrap this up. So I put the 2 main tourism websites of Corsica here, and also a couple of local blogs. They're both in English, or they have an English translation on them, but they really highlight a lot of really cool stuff to do. I always check them out when I go there. Okay, so that wraps it up. If you do want to go to Corsica, I would love it if you bought the book, took that along with you. It's available either in a paperback or an ebook. And if you do buy it through the Rough Guides website, you can scan this QR code to take you directly to the page, or just type in that webpage and search for the Rough Guide to Corsica. Do use my author code, you'll get a 30% discount. Little note on this, unfortunately, the paperback copies can only be delivered to the US or the UK. If you want the paperback and you're outside of those countries, then you can find it on Amazon. But of course, my author code won't work. Use it on the ebook. Okay, that's about it. I don't know if there are any questions, Sophie.
Zoe, you were so thorough and so excited with everything that we've answered.
Did write a book on it.
Exactly. No, it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I went to Corsica when I was really young with the family, the camping and canyoning thing. But it really made me want to go back. What a
You should. Yeah, it really is. I mean, obviously getting to research this for a job is a sort of dream job in a way.
Yeah.
Couldn't complain at that. But yeah, it really is genuinely one of my favorite areas.
Yeah, your passion really shines through. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. I hope you got some tips and recommendations from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for taking the time, Zoe. Just a couple of shout outs before we head off. The recording of our last masterclass about Josephine Baker is now live on the Video Hub. This is in part 1 and part 2. So just go to your France Today membership area and check it out if you missed the live event. And coming up next on France Today Live is a webinar on exploring the secrets of Dijon with some top tips and insider info from a local Dijonnaise. So highly recommend that one if you want the insider info. That is on October the 30th at 12 Eastern Time. Until then, from all of us at France Today, merci et à bientôt. Zoe, thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Au revoir.